So we just finished our study of the book of First Thessalonians, and so I figured we could do another 10-minute recap because it seems like some people like that. So before we dive in, I think it's important to understand who the author is, a little bit about the author. The author of this epistle is a guy named Paul. Paul, we're introduced to him in the book of Acts. He was once upon a time named Saul, and then he was the guy who was chasing and persecuting the church greatly until he had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And ever since he had that encounter, he completely did a 180 and went from persecuting the church to leading the church. And that is an amazing story all in itself. But as we dive into First Thessalonians, I think it's good to also remember in Acts chapter 17, Paul went to Thessalonica. So in Acts chapter 17, verse 1 through 3, you see that he visited Thessalonica, and he was only there for 3 weeks. Now, this is amazing for all sorts of reasons, but what I want you to understand is to make the connection that he was there for 3 weeks. He founded this church that he's writing to here, and within those 3 weeks, he taught them as much as he possibly could, including eschatology. Now, eschatology is just a fancy word that people use to say the study of end times. They're studying end times. They're eschatological kinds of conversations. But here, what I want you to take note of is that he won them to the Lord. The church was founded there, and then he had conversations with them about the end times. Now, why do we know this? It's because he's writing to them right now in First Thessalonians, and he's referencing things that he had previously already talked about during his first visit there. So he's basically saying, remember when we talked about this, this, and this? He's like, I'm just going to reiterate everything we've already talked about because he already laid that foundation. And then he was only there for 3 weeks. So don't get worried about the study of end times. It's an amazing topic. The only thing I don't want you to do is create any kind of division. If you see things differently than I do, okay, don't divide. I believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, and we will get to that when we get to chapter 4. But in chapter 1, I think it's really neat because he mentions 3 things in chapter 1, verse 3. He mentions faith, love, and hope. And so faith, love, and hope is going to be a trilogy throughout this epistle. You'll see that reference time and time again. But you can look at it as past, present, and future. Faith, love, and hope. Faith rests in the past. Love, it works in the present, and hope is in the future, and that's what we'll talk about here in a minute. But at the end of chapter 1, you get the fullest account of a Christian conversion of sorts, because in verse 9, chapter 1, verse 9, it says, "For they that declare themselves concerning of us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols, to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven." Now, those are the 3 things that Christians do, essentially, if you want to look at it through that type of lens. You turn from idols to God, then you begin to serve him, which is where fruit comes from, and then after you serve him, we are supposed to wait. There's something called the doctrine of imminency that's out there, where we are supposed to be constantly waiting for his return. It could happen at any moment, and that's an amazing thing to consider. There's nothing that needs to be fulfilled now in order for the rapture to occur. There's a bunch of stuff that needs to be fulfilled before the second coming can occur, but that's a different topic. So in chapter 2, moving forward, he goes and he talks about how being a model servant, he likens himself as a mother, uses the mother characteristics, then he uses father characteristics. Then in chapter 3, I want to talk about verse 5 real fast, because in chapter 3, verse 5, it says, "For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you." Now, this is obviously referring to Satan, but what I want to talk about here real quick is just to get you to understand Luke chapter 22. In Luke 22, Jesus goes up to Simon, and Jesus says to Simon, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat." Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is to get you to make the connection that Satan wanted to cut off Peter, but before he could, he had to get the green light from Jesus. And that's fascinating, because whatever happened to Simon first had to be filtered through Jesus himself. And the same is true for you and I. So whatever happens to you is going to be Father filtered. It's going to be filtered through Jesus Christ, and that's an important connection to make. So let's go ahead and get into 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, because in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, you got all kinds of good stuff in here. But in verse 15, it says, "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. So he's saying that the people who passed away, Christians who passed away, are referenced as sleeping. So that's what he's saying here, those who are asleep at the end of verse 15. And so that's interesting because he's saying that we're not going to go up before they are. We're not going to precede them, go before. So to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So we know that to be true. So if your mom, dad, grandchild, or whatever has passed away already and they were in Christ, they're already with the Lord. Their bodies are still here. They're still resting, but their soul is with the Lord, and that's fascinating. But in verse 16, it goes on, it says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first." Now, this is interesting because some people say that this trumpet here is one of the trumpet judgments that's referenced in the book of Revelation. Now, this is not true because this trumpet is strictly called or used for assembling people together, because that's what happens when this trumpet blasts. So if you compare this trumpet to the trumpets that are being blown in the book of Revelation, those trumpets bring nothing but bad stuff, but this trumpet brings people together and raises them up. So that is important to make that connection. But then it says, "And the dead in Christ will rise first." So the dead in Christ will rise first. And then verse 17, "Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." Now the word "caught up" here is the word harpazo. It's the Greek word harpazo. The Latin word is raptura. We derive our English word rapture. So people say that the word rapture is not in the Bible. They're right, because it's not in the English version. But if you go back and you read the Greek before you read the Latin, you will find those words in those Bibles. So it's important to make that connection. But the word harpazo means to snatch, to seize away by force. And that's quite the visual that we are getting here. But it says, "Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." Now it's important to basically pay attention to "in the air." Why? Because there's two things that people are looking forward to, in a sense. There is something called the rapture, and there's something called the second coming. They are two very, very different things. The rapture occurs first. That's the next thing on the prophetic timeline, in my opinion. So the rapture occurs first, then there's going to be 7 years of tribulation, and then after 7 years of tribulation, then there's going to be something called the second coming. The rapture is where we go up. So that's in the air. And then the second coming is where we come back to the earth, and we will be on the earth. So this is not the second coming. So this obviously has to be before the second coming. I'll post a bunch of references here on the screen somewhere so you guys can go look up some stuff if you wanted to unpack the rapture or other references if you're interested on that. But it goes on in verse 18, it says, "Therefore comfort one another with these words." So if you, that's comforting, knowing, that's our hope, our blessed hope, as Titus references in Titus chapter 2. But if you're going to comfort somebody, you're going to comfort them with some kind of hope, with some kind of good news, right? And so that's why it's man, I don't think Paul is going to be leading these people into the idea of you're going to go through some hard times, and because that wouldn't be very comforting. So that's just my take on mid-trib and post-trib. But the one thing, again, don't create any kind of division on this topic. But let's dive into chapter 5 real fast. I don't have much time. But in chapter 5, it's important to understand that he goes in verse 5 and chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, he goes to talking to the Christians, and by saying you, yourselves, you, those types of words. And then in verse 3, he changes it from you to they, or they, them. And so in verse 3, it says, "For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them." So you need to make the distinction that there are two groups here. There are you, the Christians that he's talking to, that writing this epistle to, and then there's the them who the day of the Lord is applicable to. Now, the day of the Lord, it's the time of Jacob's trouble. It's terrible. You can look that up. But it's important to make the two connections. He's writing to two groups. One group applies, or whatever he's saying here applies to one group, and it doesn't apply to the other. So he's telling them that it's not going to apply to them. So you're either children of the day or children of the night, and that's what he ends up doing here. But it's important to understand how to get to heaven to begin with, and that's by putting your faith in Christ and Christ alone. Ephesians 2:8-9, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." I hope this helps. Thanks, guys.